Good afternoon or good morning, wherever you are. Welcome to the session on social typology and the conference terms of habitation. I am Dana Weiss. I'm from the Technical University in Cluj, Romania. And I am also a member of the research group Retheorizing Housing as Architecture at the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies. And my co-host today is Dana Silverstein-Duani, our extraordinary research assistant, the research assistant of the group. I shall chair the session, introduce the four presentations and 5 speakers. We have 4 presentations and 5 speakers. And then take your questions for discussions. We have 4 terms to debate today: condominio, habitat, cooperative, and complex, in this order. All referring to post-war housing, but set in 4 different contexts: Italy, France, Lithuania, and Bulgaria. And through them, we shall see in this session too, as during the entire conference, how we can construct a common terminology on housing. In this session on social typology, we shall speak more about the inhabitants, supposedly, about how we define and how we term, how we label housing typologies in relation to specific categories of people and the social production of the space of habitation. Before we start, let me tell you how the session will develop. We asked our participants to pre-record their presentation. So I shall share with you each presentation on the Zoom screen. Then we shall have a short set of questions, about 10-15 minutes, after each presentation, questions for clarification mainly. And what's important to announce is that you may write your questions inside the chat function of the Zoom. Then after all presentations are made, we shall have a common session of discussions. So the first term is condominio, and it will be presented by Chiara Ingrosso. A few words about Chiara. Chiara Ingrosso is an architect and assistant professor in history of architecture at the Department of Architecture and Design at the University of Campania Luigi Vanvitelli, where she teaches history of architecture and design. Her research interests are related to issues and multidisciplinary projects in which contemporary architecture and the city are analyzed within the economic, political, and social processes. She won scholarships and she held seminars and workshops at universities in Barcelona, Madrid, Istanbul, Beijing, and Johannesburg. She is author of essays and monographs published in Italy and abroad, among which one on architecture, city, and society in Barcelona, 1975-2015, and another on condomini napoletani. She also edited works, particularly on housing in Napoli and Barcelona. So let me share the screen and load the video for you. And it's the first time I'm doing this. So let me see. Okay. Can you see it? Can you hear it?
Good evening. The condominio. New housing model during the Italian boom. Quantity. After the Second World War, in the Italian cities, new model of living spread, multi-level palazzine, isolated or inserted in residential park, with gardens and collective spaces. Condomini, which follow the laws of the consolidated city, aggregated to form urban curtains, conformed by building regulations. According to the local policies and the socio-economic changes, living in the city and living in a condominio was a peculiar choice for Italian family, contrary to what was happening at the same time in other countries, especially in the UK and America, where the suburban model was consolidating. Condomini were perhaps the clearest expression of the prevailing housing model based on private ownership and on the typical urban growth of that period called concentration spontaneity, devoid in most cases of any level of planning. Many urban stories have been written based on the denunciation of this growth linked to the so-called speculazione edilizia, and therefore on quantities. Indeed, the data describes an impressive increase in homes. The house built in Italy went from 148,000 in 1953 to 270,000 in 1958 and 450,000 in 1964, recording a 400% increase in investments, public and private, in housing between 1951 and 1964, while construction workers increased from 1,100,000 in 1951 to 2,100,000 in 1964. The legislative framework confirms a definite political economic orientation based on this model. In 1949, the law to increase worker employment, facilitating the construction of houses for workers, promoted by Amintore Fanfani, the Christian Democratic Minister of Labor and Social Security, was promulgated. And based on it, the Ina Casa plan started. On the same year was the Topini law, which granted contribution for public housing and established tax exemptions for non-luxury private homes completed by 1955. In 1950, the Aldisio law was added, which established the granting of loans for the construction of residential houses. Ownership. Typologically, the palazzina is composed of a volume isolated on 4 sides of different height and with a small central courtyard. It appeared in many Italian cities like Naples and Rome at the beginning of 1900s, especially in the areas of middle-class expansion of the ancient city. While the villa was generally owned by a single property, the palazzina could consist of several apartments that occupied the entire floor of 2 or more families. The condominio, as a type of real estates divided into several units that are each separate homed, rose up in Italy in the 1930s, when during fascism access to home ownership was facilitated instead of renting. For recognition of the condominio as a widespread system became effective only in 1939, when the new urban land registry introduced taxation for a property unit in place of taxation for a building or portion of it, thereby facilitating the transmission of single units. Several national political measures that sanctioned the release of the rent and favored the spread of condominio and not rather the undivided property advocated by the left, in conjunction with the expansion of building credit, provoked the importance conferred on property by the fascist regime. From that moment, the property was conceived as something stratified, and it was possible to exploit the soil intensively through multi-story buildings. Living in a condominio became definitely a new housing model after World War II, from the end of 1940s and during 1950s, when Italy experienced an important economic boom. From 1952 for around 10 years, Italy lived through that particular time of historical economic miracle. A number of factors, including the end of prohibition, energy self-sufficiency, and low cost of wage, paved the way for a boom without precedent. Between 1958 and 1963, Italy became, from an almost interior agricultural country, one of the most industrialized Western countries. The urban and rural landscape, houses and lifestyles underwent a radical change during the economic miracle, and building in particular was a powerful driver for the Italian economy among the new free market-based neoliberal politics. For both public and private housing, home ownership constitutes one of the political priorities of the Italian democratic government, because, as Amintore Fanfani said, the home ownership increases the freedom of individuals. Overall, between 1950s and 1960s, the Italian governments encouraged the purchase of apartments as well as through bank loans with the progressive liberalization of the rental market, and they gave maximum freedom to private construction initiative. Between 1946 and 1963, only 16% of investments were allocated to public construction works, with peaks around 1959 in conjunction with the implementation of the Ina Casa plan. According to the Istat data, the number of owned homes rose significantly from 14% in 1951 to 52.8% in 1969. While for the public dwellings, the criticism is almost compact in identifying it as an excellence, so the Ina Casa neighborhoods are considered among examples of the best Italian architecture. For private housing, its aptitude could be described as embarrassed, preferring as it were to turn a blind eye to the work carried out in those years. Desires. Individualism, consumerism, and the myth of ownership combined with the needs for maximum exploitation of the soil led to the expansion of this model housing. Living in a condominio considered with an intimate, isolated way of life, but also linked to the privilege of privacy, which was affirmed in those years as a middle-class value, as opposed to the promiscuity of the popular neighborhoods. It is a social change triggered by the boom for which, according to Paul Gisborg, the private prevailing over the public, the individual over the community. In a more recent years, critics started to look with a different perspective at this architecture, which coincided with the housing model most used in medium-large Italian cities and which even today constitutes the majority of their urban fabric. The condominio, with the declination of the palazzina, even the most ordinary, was studied as a witness to a long-lasting historical process that exploded with the modernization of the country, and which recently, starting from the global economic crisis, has taken on new values until the alleged disappearance of the middle classes. Living in a condominio started to be studied as a reflection of the demand and wishes of entire groups of the population seeking comfort and modernity. This aspiration of the market has already been studied by cultural histories as having led the production and consumption of goods at an even more accelerated rate, influenced by the example overseas. Less investigated, however, are the methods by which the new imaginary driven by advertising and the new marketing affected housing. How the home also became a consumer item included in the mechanism of competitiveness. In this sense, the palazzina and more generally the condominio took on a fundamental symbolic value by becoming a genuine object of desire for the emerging middle class in 1950s. The same dichotomy, public-private architecture, has been reinterpreted in a more problematic way. Indeed, private building was favored and was generally high stimulated by state and local authorities through finance and denning it benefited from through a dense series of laws founded in the fascist tradition, when building, whether public or private, was considered a highly significant factor of the national economy and therefore to be incentivized as much as possible by administration. The majority of the laws and public funds, including the Tupini law in 1949, facilitated private building, contributing to the enrichment of those who decide to invest in bricks and mortar during the boom year. It was broadly demonstrated that that even state building, including in particular the Ina Casa project, contributed to feed the sprawl of cities and the generation of peripheral land, which facilitate private investment and even unauthorized building. Furthermore, the mechanism of the variance and the even more frequent deviation from the plans in urban transformation of all Italian cities at that time fall fully within this process. Case studies. Far away from the experimentation formal period of the first rationalist international vanguard, the condominio was characterized by force and showy variety in order to diversify the product home and make it desirable to the new ascending middle class, a remedy to the repetition of homogeneity imposed by the law of the maximum land use and standardization. The starting point was the beam pillar structural grid of the domino house, reworked in new combination and through a hybrid language contaminated by international influences and local references. In Rome, due to the morphology, in Rome, to accommodate the taste of the new middle class, it became more communicative and captivating. It opened up to the fashion and generally abandoned the needs for decorum in favor of a deliberately flashy symbolism that testified to the achievement of social status. Due to the morphology of the capital, composed mostly of lots in a checkerboard system, the building of the palazzine spread. Some example are the well-known palazzina by Luigi Moretti, il girasole. But also many buildings by other professionals like Ugo Luccichenti, Palazzina in Via Fratelli Ruspoli, and the piazzale and the complex in Piazzale delle Medaglie d'Oro. And Vincenzo Monaco and Amedeo Luccichenti, Palazzina in Via San Crescenziano. And Palazzina in Via San Valentino. In Milan, because of the block arrangement of the buildings, residential complexes with the courtyards and with similar heights side by side to create a continuous line were built. Critics call them condomini, making explicit reference to their property regime. If a red thread can be found that unites the experimentation of the various ponti, gardelle, and cacciadominioni, it consists precisely in the common strategy of diversification of the plans of the apartments and therefore also of the different floors of the condomini, elaborating complex and articulated layouts and facades. As example of typical Milanese condomini, we can mention that in Via Ippolito Nievo and in Via Carbonari by Luigi Cacciadominioni, the condominio in Via Dezza by Gio Ponti, and the condominio in Via Broletto by Luigi Figgini and Gino Pollini. In Naples, from the post-war years, isolated condomini spread in several urban areas and were built according to the legislation and the complex topography of the city. What made the modern Neapolitan condomini unique in the Italian panorama was the relationship with the landscape, the morphological and topological characteristic of the city. In fact, the best Neapolitan condomini were able to fit into the various slopes by exploiting the peculiar landscape condition, the orientation and the light dictated by the presence of the bay in the south, the relationship with the sea, the presence of banks of tuff, which in many cases form the ground on which to rest or excavate buildings. In many of them, recurring are the patios, garden terraces, balconies, and windows that pierce the elevation to open views of the outside, while the interiors are arranged according to the panoramic view, so the living area is placed directly facing the sea and the service areas at the back. The strong sunlight is used both in the facade and in the interiors to create refractive effects through the use of bright colors and through the use of polychrome, maiolica, and tuff. To give some example, we can mention the Palazzina in Via Manzoni by Francesco Di Salvo and Vittorio Amicarelli. The condominio in the Comola Ricci Park by Michele Capobianco. Palazzo della Morte by Stefania Filo Speziale. And finally, the Palazzine in Via Petrarca by Davide Paganowski. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Is it okay? Can you hear me? I'm not sure what I'm doing.
We hear you.
Yes, okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chiara. Thank you for your presentation. I remind you that you may write questions for Chiara in the chat function. I'm looking at it now and I don't see any question yet. So while you write a question, I would like to make some subjective maybe observation about Chiara's presentation. I found several inciting things in it. First of all, that it's a term with many connotations, condominio, a term that works at many levels. It's about a real estate development, an ownership regime, but also a type of urban form, a lifestyle, a social status indicator, or at the imaginary level, an object of desire. It's way more than just a term for a label for a typology. My second observation, what I found interesting was that this is subjective, that condominio is a notion that can conquer, so to speak, other forms of housing or of housing production. Public housing can become condominium through the process of privatization. And we in Eastern Europe, we're very familiar with this, at least in Romania. The socialist housing was sold, and now in the last decades, and now we all live in condominiums too. And my third observation, which I find the most interesting, is the notion of declination that you wrote in your paper. The very interesting way you used it, palazzina as a declination from condominio, because it shows not just the way from a more general term to a more particular term, but from housing as real estate to housing as architecture. And this is my first question. How important is architectural typology, architecture, for condominium success?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
So,
I mean, was fundamental in the sense that, as I try to explain, through the typology and in generally through the form, the morphology of this kind of housing, the house became like an object of desire. So it was a way to be like in items to be sold. So in the typology was fundamental in the sense that I mean, what do you mean when you say the typology? Because the typology, in the sense of palazzina, I mean the free sides and courtyard inside. Do you mean that?
Yes, I mean a typology that is defined spatially.
Okay.
It's a kind of space. So it's the physical form. The typology understood architecturally in the physical form of production, or the other sense is that
as you already said, the condominium was something about property. So the palazzina was a case, a case of condominio, a particular declination of the condominio. The palazzina born before than the condominio, because the palazzina born in and spread at the beginning of 20th century, like a declination of the villa. Okay, so it was a villa made by 3 floors for one family. So the palazzina became a condominium when the legislation introduced this kind of property that was also divided into different floors. So the typology of this kind of building made by different floors became biggest with the boom, with the economic miracle after the second post-war, because of this legislation combined with the typology already introduced before, and also with technique that led possible to construct this kind of structure that was, as I show, the domino house, so it was really a combination, a cultural combination, legislative combination, and also typology combination that made the condominio, the modern condominio. So in this sense, typology started to be important in the sense of individualism, in the sense to have to give a comfort to this middle class of the second post-war. In this sense, it was important because of was linked to the privilege to be, you know, to the privacy also, to live in apartment, private apartment, overseeing the sea in the Neapolitan case, for example. And also it was important the localization where these kind of condomini were built, and in this sense, in which part of the city, you know, because it was all the area was an expansion area of from outside the ancient city. So I mean, this happened in all the Italian city, because in this area there were a lot of free soil, you know, to construct.
Okay, thank you. We have a question from Nicole De Toni. Hello, Chiara. Hello, everyone. And thank you for your presentation. You presented an interesting list of cases by what is known in Italy as professionismo colto, something like educated professionals. In your research, how much this selection is representative of the condominium built stock of the post-war Italian cities?
I try to underline, I mean, not the ordinary condomini. I mean, all the first part of my paper, it was about the, you know, the urban growth, so the typology, and so it was about the ordinary building. But just to give some good examples of condomini, I prefer to highlight the, I mean, not also the professionismo colto, but also, I mean, the best cases of condomini, Italian condomini. This is I choose, I mean, but there are depend on how you want to, because my goal was to underline the quality inside this kind of housing, not just to denounce, you know, the building speculation, speculazione edilizia, and because there are a lot of studies about that. So this was my goal, just my choice.
Okay, thank you. I suggest we go to the next paper and we'll continue the discussion afterward. Thank you, Chiara. I will share now our second presentation.
Dear Itzhak Hen, Director of the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies, dear Yael Alvey, Technion Institute of Technology.
Excuse me, please. Excuse me. Excuse me, I made a mistake. I'm sorry. Our next paper is about the term habitat, and we have two speakers, Anna Tostoes and Zara Ferreira, and I shall first present them. So I'm sorry, I'm nervous. Anna Tostoes is PhD architect, and besides her degree in architecture, she also has a master's degree in history of art and holds a PhD on culture and technology in modern architecture. She is a full professor at the Instituto Superior Técnico, the University of Lisbon, where she is the coordinator for architecture and also an architecture critic and historian, chair of Docomomo International in Lisbon, Portugal, and editor of the Docomomo Journal. Her research field is the critical history and theory of contemporary architecture, focusing on the relationship between European, Asian, African, and American cultures. On this topic, she has published books and essays, curated exhibitions, organized scientific events, coordinated research projects, supervised theses, taken part in juries and committees, and given lecture worldwide. She was awarded the Gulbenkian Prize in 2014 for the research project Exchanging World Visions on Sub-Sahara African architecture during the modern movement period, project that she coordinated. Zara Ferreira is an architect and a PhD student at the Instituto Superior Técnico, the University of Lisbon. She has a master in architecture from the same institute with a dissertation of Lusophone Africa. She was the Secretary General of Docomomo International and co-editor of Docomomo Journal between 2014 and 2018. The PhD she is currently doing at the University of Lisbon and the École Polytechnique Fédérale de Lausanne with a doctoral fellowship from the Portuguese Foundation for Science and Technology, focuses on the preservation of the post-war sites and neighborhoods. And now let me share the screen.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Dear Itzhak Hen, Director of the Israel Institute for Advanced Studies, dear Yael Alvey, Technion Institute of Technology, dear Gaia Caramelino from Politecnico di Milano, Susan Schindler from MIT and ETH Zurich, and the fellows of the research group Re-Theorizing the Architecture of Housing as Grounds for Research and Practice. Good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity to present this paper, and congratulations for the ability to organize this conference during these really hard times we are going through. The word habitat comes from the Latin habitare, to dwell, coming itself from habere, to have. From the relationship between these two terms, habitat could mean the place where we live belonging to us. Not belonging in the sense of ownership, but as something acting as the extension of our own existence. Coming itself from the natural sciences, from 19th and 20th century dictionaries, the scientific meaning of habitat does not vary much. It is the natural environment of the species. Even though man often forget about that, the human is an animal species. However, their environment is not solely natural, as architecture is an artificial product. This paradox might be at the origin of the struggle to define habitat in the context of urban societies. Absent from architectural discourse before the Second World War, the term was introduced into international debate by Le Corbusier in the International Congress of Modern Architecture, the 7th, in Bergamo, Italy in 1949, when stating that Siam should devote its effort to the elaboration of a Charter of Habitat to replace the Athens Charter. The Siam 9 in Aix-en-Provence in France, 1953, finally approached the theme. The struggle to find an equivalent term in English and German was the main reason why Siam was unable to reach a consensus about its definition. Habitat is without dictionaries and without specialists, said Candilis at the meeting. Mumford explains, habitat in French was difficult to translate into English, as it meant both the living conditions of any creature and dwelling or settlement. In a circular letter written among Jacqueline Try Wright, Siegfried Gideon and Le Corbusier, habitat is described as something larger than housing and smaller than neighborhood. In other words, the setting of daily human life. Despite disagreements, Pedret stated that habitat was generally understood as an environment able to accommodate the total and harmonious spiritual, intellectual, and physical fulfillment of its inhabitants. The phrase habitat, pour le grand nombre, is often attributed to an intervention by George Candilis and Michel Ecochard at the same Siam 9 on the behalf of Atbat. With a special attention to the cultural framework of their action, their concept of habitat lied somewhere in the relationship between the modern and the vernacular. However, the most pressing meaning that echoed from Habitat pour le grand nombre was the urgency of providing homes for the greatest number. In France, 3 million people had emerged from the war without a home. Furthermore, the majority of French dwellings had no running water, 75% had no toilet, and 90% had no shower. A decade later, collective housing blocks featuring running water, central heating, modern kitchens, and well-lit rooms will shape the outskirts landscape all over the country. During the 3 decades of post-war economic growth, the so-called Trente Glorieuses between 1946 and 1975, in the framework of the welfare state and following Henri Selliers' interwar concept of Une cité pour tous, the French government committed itself to solve the successive housing crises. Essentially, Habitat pour le grand nombre meant a shift in scale. The time had to come for the large-scale application, the principles of modern architecture and engineering developed in the interwar period, and to pursue the main social goal of the modern movement, architecture as a vehicle for the new and egalitarian society.
The most powerful institution working as a laboratory for the development of housing techniques and typologies was the Ministry of Reconstruction and Urbanism, created in 1944. It was committed to solve the housing shortage and provide the best one-size-fits-all home for everyone. Rational and functionally organized, built to the proportions of adults, children and their needs, with separational functions and filled with the facilities that assure the physiological and psychological comfort of the inhabitants, the modern home aimed to give the average person the opportunity to explore and achieve his or her full potential. Épanouissement, blossoming, became the common term to describe the ultimate purpose of the modern home. The same purpose Siam had agreed to attribute to Habitat in 1953. Eliminating class, gender and age, dwellings would be provided with running water, electricity, cooking equipment, central heating, ventilation, waste disposal, a luxury for the majority of the population. Among the first attempts to implement these intentions were the program Immeubles sans affectation individuelle, where it can be seen careful attention to the design of the interior comfort, with generous space, rational organization, creative solutions. Between 1947 and 1951, the ministry launched experimental building competitions for the development of new solutions for the housing industry. Eugène-Claude Petit, as head of the ministry, was the ultimate responsible for orienting housing policy towards the production of high-rise buildings. In those 4 years, housing production took the leap with the building of the first Grand Ensemble, reinforced by the program Secteur Industrialisé, with the aim of building 240,000 dwellings per year over the following 40 years. The term Grand Ensemble appeared for the first time in an article of the journal L'Architecture d'aujourd'hui in 1935 about La Cité de la Mouette in Drancy. The term was commonly used from the 50s onwards to designate the large-scale collective housing estates that proliferated all over the country in the form of blocks and towers. Looking at the article, we must dream of seeing the children clean and happy, playing on the grass, and at the many of the projects built in the immediate post-war years, it can be said that the intention to develop a healthy and sustainable habitat was on the agenda, even if the main efforts were first centered on building technology and interior comfort. It is interesting to note that Monique Lab identified the Grand Ensemble as an architectonic morphological type that would soon be commonly considered the habitat reserved for the working classes. By the mid-50s, substantial immigration, a rural exodus and a baby boom exacerbated the housing shortage to new levels, brought to public attention by the press and revealed in the growth of the bidonville shantytowns. Once it became evident that more effective solutions were necessary, Pierre Courin implemented the Plan Courin, comprising a program of plan types to be reproduced on a large scale, known as Logecos. These would be followed by the programs LEN, Lupofa and Opération Million. These initiatives were responsible for the drastic reduction of their quality, with the size and comfort of dwellings being reduced in successive programs. Criticism was spread among architectural groups concerning the mediocrity of the architecture that these initiatives produced. The post-war period until the end of the 50s was a time marked by experimentation in political, architectonic and technical terms. Successive housing crises had to be solved quickly and on a large scale, with social science trying to find a help solution for everyone. All this research was based on ambition to satisfy the needs of the usager, the user, in which people were envisaged as abstract elements and generic beneficiaries in the calculations of state planning.
In 1968, Henri Lefebvre says that the right to the city manifests itself as the superior form of right to freedom, to individualization within socialization, to habitat and to inhabit it. The start of the 1960s was marked by growing criticism of the Grand Ensemble. Dormitory cities, concentration camp, and rabbit cages were among the terms commonly used to criticize their physical isolation, lack of amenities, uniformity of massive scale of their architecture, the absence of natural elements and meeting places, and they were blamed for leaving people socially isolated, leading to boredom, psychological illness, and delinquency. The need to transform the grands ensembles into thriving neighborhoods became evident, and throughout the 60s, the issue of housing changed from questions about its efficient provision to discussions on its proper integration into the urban framework, from the way people lived within the family and in their homes to their relationship with the community. The term équipement, used to designate all the collective facilities supporting everyday life, became central to the policy of Pierre Sudreau. In 1959, the Grille du Pont was published, including 85 types of facilities that should be considered in the design of housing estates as pôles d'animation, or participatory centers. The goal was to rethink the Grand Ensemble in its totality from the individual home to the city, rescuing the traditional notion of the street as a socially active center. The idea of freedom of choice, reinforced by the rise of a middle class with purchasing power and the recent notion of lifestyle, was used to promote villes nouvelles, or new towns, proclaimed as containers of a new way of life, where future inhabitants will be citizens of a new kind of city. Launched in 1965, Ville Nouvelle arose from a growing belief that it was not enough to house inhabitants in apartments, but that it was also necessary to create their everyday environment, their habitat. Reinforced by the events of May 68 and Henri Lefebvre's Right to the City, the relationship between housing and the city began to include a notion of habitat that connected individuality, linked with the notion of appropriation, with collectivity, related to the concept of participation. With appropriation and participation, whether in new cities or animated housing estates, people will be more closely involved in the development of their own habitat than in earlier functionalist response to the concept of need.
In the second half of the 60s, the construction of a grand ensemble began to decrease when Jacques Maziol decided to prioritize the construction of single-family houses that soon would be the most common way of living for the middle class as a powerful tool of social distinction. Left in the previous housing stock were those unable to acquire their own houses, mainly composed of French Algerians who had settled in mainland France after the end of the French-Algerian War in 62, as well as the poor, young families and the elderly. In the meantime, state planners sought to reconcile popular preferences while avoiding the politically fatal phenomenon of social segregation. Instead of unifying the nation by building the same home for everyone, they now thought that intermediate habitats might mold the integration of different parts of different individuals into a unified whole. This meant implementing research in the third way between the grand ensemble and the single-family house, between the individual and the collective. The words of Candilis are clear in the distinction of both universes. Habitat is always collective. Habitation must always be individual. The idea was to give collective housing the qualities of a single house. The housing unit acted as the basic element for testing different assemblages, connected so as to ensure the apartments had a sense of privacy, through large private terraces and a dependent entrance to dwellings. In the interior, spaces were angled to allow inhabitants to appropriate the space according to their needs and wishes with more flexibility. Transformations occurring in society, women start working outside home, an increased number of cadres, and the growth of consumerism as the new paradigmatic lifestyle, were rendering the previous formulas obsolete. The variety of lifestyles demanded fresh changes, and individuals who are now consumers in search of distinguished options more than as citizens bearing the right to housing. Extending the social doctrine of participation, architects looked into the notion of habitat evolutif, adaptive dwelling, studying possible variations of open plans that could be compartmented by movable partitions and changed over time. Flexibility was considered the most important component of a functionalism that no longer aimed to locate different functions to different rooms. But this was something that remained within architectural circles with few real repercussion. In the light of an emerging postmodern society, within the framework of a liberal government, reinforced by the shift in the international economic situation after the oil crisis of 73, architecture stopped to be seen as a social instrument.
Coming back to the definition proposed at the beginning of the paper, habitat as the place where we live belonging to us, it is important to note that humans have a layer that other species do not, which is culture. Therefore, living in a place that belongs to us is intrinsically connected with questions of identity. That explains why the word habitat in the architectural framework is commonly associated with architecture developed in close connection with its regional and local environment, which conflicts with the idea of architecture applicable to all. When dealing with a society changing faster than its housing provision, and in a framework of exodus and immigration, it becomes even harder to consider questions of identity. Even so, and although not all efforts brought their desired results, the French state kept trying until the very end of Les Trente Glorieuses to accompany social changes, technical revolutions, and people's needs. More than the examples of exquisite architectural quality which so often fill our architecture books, it has left the legacy of a political will that effectively contributed to providing housing for the greatest number and that tried to improve their habitat, envisaged as the relationship between habitational, private family, and civic collective spaces, the setting of daily human life. From their poor energy performance in today's far more demanding requirements to the rigidity of their internal spaces, hard to adapt to current lifestyles, post-war housing estates are now falling into a dangerous state of obsolescence. More than 700 estates housing more than 5 million inhabitants have been identified as urban problem areas by the government. On the other hand, they stand as a symbol of the efforts to develop architecture as a vehicle for an egalitarian society. Between discourses of love and hate, the debate on it keeps oscillating between demolition and renovation. In the overall context of neoliberal policies, economic, private and individual, values retain the upper hand over social, public and collective ones. While the urban centers, musealized for tourist exploitation and occupied by Airbnb, there is no space to live. Before the products of the welfare state disappear, collective efforts must keep evolving toward the establishment of a route for restoring the idea of the right to house. It is vital to develop a line of research and professional activity capable of distinguishing between obsolescence and resilience, capable of preserving this architectural production while meeting contemporary standards of personal comfort and citizenship.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for your presentation. If there are questions, please, I remind you, you may write them in chat. And meanwhile, I'll make some observations. I thought that it was interesting how your presentation highlighted the versatility of the notion of habitat. We saw that habitat is maybe the most clearly a notion that is relational, that refers both to environment and inhabitants at once. It denotes a space that is continually produced by those who inhabit it. It is also a notion of in-between. It's larger than housing, but smaller than neighborhood. It's in between the modern and the vernacular. So it's a notion that it's kind of hard to catch, to grasp actually. And for that, we saw that it's a notion that works well, maybe even best, in its declinations. I'm using Chiara's word. Habitat intermédiaire, habitat évolutif, and I can give you another one, habitat prospectif. I'm subjective again. So maybe what's most interesting for this term is that habitat is able to enter in this kind of combination of terms where the adjective somehow is more clarifying and becomes more of a subject than the noun itself in what the term denotes. And I find this adjectival terming, if I may use these words, worth highlighting because it translates precisely the very nature of habitat, the versatile nation of habitat. And it's a general notion that it's better understood through the specific form it takes, actually, almost only through the specific forms it takes. And actually your presentation too was specifically in relation to the grands ensembles and the history of the grands ensembles in France. So I don't have actually a question. I just thought, how could I formulate this? But my question is about this difficulty. How do you think we could address the difficulty of this kind of notions, and in your case, habitat, that actually is hard to catch, and it exists in derivatives better, it functions in this form that is derivative. I don't know if it's very clear. Actually, I would like a comment about this difficulty.
Perhaps I could say, and then Zara, perhaps you may add afterwards. It's okay. I think nowadays, as we are in the, let's say, starting the third decade of the 21st century, I think it's possible now to have a kind of a balanced approach to this very round concept of habitat. I will explain my point. The thing is, habitat is in fact a very Latin expression and word. And we mostly speak in English now. So we have, but what I think is that if, let's say 70 years ago or 80 years ago, there was in fact a big cultural shift, you know, between the French speakers and the Anglo-Saxonic, and there was in fact, I believe, a lack of comprehension of it. It was not understood by all the meaning of habitat. It's what I mean. And nowadays, I think it's possible, perhaps because most of us, we communicate in a kind of an Anglo-Saxonic words, in a kind of English, that the habitat idea has came to this English lexicon. And I think this is very important because it has a lot to do with the future of human life. Habitat is the source of everything. As you told very well, it's the construction, but it's the environment as well. And this is a very specific key of this term, and perhaps that it was because of that in the Siams it was very hard for them to find a common word to talk, to say the same things, people from different places of the world, with different cultures, with different natures. So I would say that we were very happy, Zara and me, that you in a way forced us to go in this direction of the meaning of the words, very much the significance of this rounding habitat and the difference concerning housing, le grand nombre, etc. Of course, we concentrate in France because it's something that we are working quite deep, because it's really interesting, this role of politicians, namely Eugène Claudius Petit after the war, and all the contributions of France concerning habitat, I'll say, and we think that it's not, we must look at it once again, I think. So Zara, I stop now.
Okay, thank you. Answering to your question, your comment then about the difficulties of, you are listening it well? Yes? Okay. I believe the difficulty lies on the fact that habitat is a concept intrinsically linked with people, in this case, of course. So in the society is always changing, in most of the time faster than architecture. So I'm not sure if it was clear in our presentation, but we organized our research in three main moments of the way the society evolved and the way the state institutions looked at that evolution. The first moment, people are envisaged as users, then they turn citizens, and in the end they are already consumers. So our notion of the evolution of habitat lied necessarily on this evolution of the society. And I believe that's why it's difficult to keep on with the notions of habitat and their architectural reflection, because society is always changing, and not in a slow motion most of the time, as we can see in this moment. From a moment to another, our life are completely changed.
Okay, thank you very much. There is no question on chat, right? I don't see any questions. So I suggest we go to the next presentation, and we'll resume the discussion afterwards. Our next term is cooperative, and it will be developed by Marija Dremaite. A few words about Marija. Marija Dremaite is a professor at Vilnius University, Faculty of History. She holds a PhD in the history of architecture. Her research is focused on the 20th century architecture, modernism, and cultural heritage. She is the author of Baltic Modernism, Architecture and Housing in Soviet Lithuania, which was published recently by Dawn Publishers in Berlin. And she also recently edited a volume on Architecture of Optimism, the Kaunas Phenomenon, 1918-1940. Currently, she runs a research project on residential architecture in Soviet Lithuania. So I will share now her video.
Hello, my name is Marija Dremaite. I'm from Vilnius University, and today I would like to share with you my presentation. Class which arises when we want to attribute this term to Soviet society that was officially known as classless. The social stratification of society is usually defined by the income and profession, but in the Soviet Union, social ranking was guaranteed rather by power and privileges. The socialist market, as a politically regulated field of social relations, is the guide by which sociologists study the various social groups and the elite in the supposedly classless Soviet society. In viewing the class structure through the housing consumption, I would like to propose the hypothesis that the acquisition and consumption of cooperative housing helped to shape a Soviet middle class. Three types of housing tenure existed in the Soviet Union: state-owned, whether communal or associated to a particular state agency, private, and cooperative. However, within each group, there existed huge variety of housing forms and comfort. For example, within a state-owned group, the range of apartments could vary from the Communist Party elite, privileged nomenclatural houses, to the mass housing in a standard large panel block, where the apartments were provided for free, but there were waiting lines. A cooperative housing was first introduced in the 20s as a suitable type of housing tenure to encourage collective living. Cooperative housing was abolished by Stalin in 1937. The ban on building individual houses in large cities in 1958 reintroduced a cooperative housing program in 1962 as a substitute for the cessation of private, individual, and single-family houses. In large urban areas. Cooperative apartment arrangements meant that residents contributed their own funds to housing construction, thereby shortening their time on the waiting list and securing the opportunity to build an apartment that was larger than what may have been allocated to them according to regulations. Politically, cooperative housing promised a solution to the difficult situation posed by the well-known Soviet apartment shortage. Architecturally, it served as a field for experimentation for architects eager to express more varied planning ideas. From a social perspective, the process accelerated the concentration of more affluent urban dwellers. Cooperative housing was encouraged and increasingly emphasized in economic plans. The state objective of this type of housing was to help meet the demand for housing not already met by the state. But in practice, it proved to be a popular housing arrangement for those sections of society able to afford the necessary down payment on an apartment. Schemes allowed groups of citizens to combine their efforts and become shareholders in a venture to build a multi-apartment complex for their own occupancy. Cooperatives operated simply on the basis of a group of households sharing the cost of the down payment for an apartment block and taking out state credits of 60 to 70%, repayable over 10 to 20 years at an interest rate of 0.5%. This type of housing afforded a means of channeling significant amounts of money directly from the populace into housing, relieving the burden of the state. Such apartments were seen as indications of great material success. Cooperatives for apartment housing construction were allowed to be established within local councils or under the jurisdiction of industrial enterprises and professional organizations. The structures were required to be built using standardized designs, as you can see in the picture, but cooperative housing options ranged considerably since the standard of comfort also depended on available finances, the position of the sponsoring organization, and informal ties existing between the cooperative with the local bureaucracy. The main advantages included a better selection of building materials, more comfortable apartment layouts, and even more importantly, better neighborhood. A cooperative building might be a very simple, standard prefab slab built in a suburban residential area, but it was better maintained and looked after and consisted of better planned apartment units, extra utility space, and the opportunity to outfit more rooms than the standard per person, 9 square meters norm. Standard government housing usually limited family apartment units to 2 rooms. The diversity of cooperative housing design increased in the late Soviet period with an ever-increasing number of petitions for permits to design custom plans. Cooperative housing, therefore, served as a field for experimentation for architects eager to express more varied planning ideas. In the 70s, custom design buildings began appearing in the historic quarters of Vilnius and Kaunas that were influenced by non-traditional land plots and historic surroundings. It had already become widely accepted that standardized designs were not suited for historic districts. In the mid-80s, postmodernist multi-unit apartments buildings also began to appear. Members of artistic organizations were also allowed to apply for larger living space arrangements justified by the need for a creative studio or a study room. Members of such organizations formed housing cooperatives and were given the right to apply for land plots for the construction of a house or group of houses and to request permits for custom designed plans based on the special purpose designation of such buildings. As socialism progressed, artistic unions advantageously used the possibility to build cooperative flats with studios, which meant highly desired extra space. True to their name, artistic and cultural workers, together with architects, showed much more creativity than the Communist Party elite or the technical community. Their projects produced such highly improbable Soviet urban housing schemes like semi-detached houses of 2 or 3 floors with separate entrances, fireplaces, and halls. In 1967, several artists, sculptors, and designers formed a housing cooperative under the name of Manas or Art and organized the construction of creative workshops with adjoining flats. The group managed to secure a land plot near a wooded area and a permit for a custom design by architect Algimantas Mačiulis. In the early 80s, the young architect Algirdas Kaušpėdas founded a housing cooperative for architects and designed a postmodern complex of 24 cottages in Kaunas. Apartments like these, with living space distributed over 2 floors, were still unusual in the Soviet Union, and their construction was evidence of increasing liberalization and the growing search for Western quality in residential housing. Though the search for architectural uniqueness was important, cooperative housing's social aspect was paramount, since residents placed the most value on a good community and neighborhood, avoiding strangers in their housing cooperative and emphasizing people over architecture. In addition to providing a much faster way to obtain an apartment, housing cooperatives also promised greater comfort over standard apartments and the assurance of living among like-minded neighbors who would care for their own property. Cooperative buildings built to standard designs in multi-unit apartment districts were still considered to be superior in quality, known to be clean and orderly, with well-maintained stables and surroundings. It was said that one could always tell a cooperative building by its clean stables and front door. Soviet citizens who owned cooperative apartments could be conditionally referred as Soviet society's middle class, enjoying higher incomes and the privilege of using their earnings to acquire better residential housing. So it is not actually the conclusion of the research, but merely a hypothesis for discussion in the housing research of middle class when we research Soviet society and try to define what was the middle class in Soviet society. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh, just a minute. Thank you, Marija. Indeed, I think that the most interesting question for us here is how could we define middle class in the former Soviet bloc context, a so-called classless society? So this is the issue, the first issue of all. And also, how can we use housing typologies or housing production forms for identifying and defining this middle class? And this also sends us further to a more general question, maybe, but very relevant for our session, on how exactly or if a class or social category is defined through its housing. How elements or practices related to residential architecture, as you wrote in your paper, define social status. These are comments, not questions yet. So I think that in this, cooperative enters in perfect dialogue with Chiara's Condominio, which was also a form of housing production that specifically aimed at creating the middle class eventually. So this is interesting to compare. Does cooperative housing promote the same privacy, the same individualism as the forms based on private property? What are the differences? It certainly introduces some social differentiation and advantage, and even a kind of freedom. Another observation, which I think is important, is the issue of looking for the middle class in researching housing in the communist states. Leads us to a more general and maybe more important question at the methodological level. When we import as such notions and terms from another context, which are maybe less appropriate for us in our context, how do we work with them? Do we keep terms as such? Do we talk about middle class housing? Do we have to talk about middle class housing and force a redefinition? Or do we use other terms altogether, trying to preserve more or less the same idea? So it's a question, but it may be a rhetorical question. I have a question, actually a question for you. I would be interested, how did cooperative housing function in time in the specific case of Lithuania? Was there any mobility in this kind of housing? I suppose the apartment could be, the right to the apartment could be left as inheritance. Could it be passed on to another person? That's my question.
Thank you, Dana, for comments. Yes, indeed. We can know from empirical research that there was social stratification in the socialist society and Soviet society. Usually we call it informal. Therefore, of course, it can fit into the Western liberal democracy and free market economy, where middle class can be very well defined. And of course, sociologists that research Soviet society, contemporary sociologists and Sovietologists, come to this question and discuss about this question. And I found out one social anthropologist who also questions this. So since it is still a work in progress, I will research it more precisely. But of course, it is very important that we need not to fit into middle class definition of the Western society, and to describe somehow the social stratification through consumption, through informal, very often informal consumption in the socialist market and socialist society. Responding to your question, yes, it is. The answer is yes. In time, cooperative houses are doing better. What do I mean? The ownership changes much less dynamic than in communal houses, because in the past 30 years of independent states and market economy, residents in those mass housing areas changed a lot, and there was migration to better apartments, to private houses, but in cooperative houses, since they were better equipped and usually better planned and usually involved personal finances, these changes affected them less, because usually the family members, children or grandchildren usually are living in those apartments. So we can see that cooperative apartments were cherished in a way better than the state-provided communal apartments.
Thank you. Is there any question for Marija? There's nothing on chat. Okay, we can continue the discussion afterwards. Now we go on with our last presentation for today. It's the term complex, and it's presented by Veneta Zlatinova-Pavlova, which is a senior assistant professor at the Department of Urban Planning, University of Architecture, Civil Engineering and Geodesy in Sofia, Bulgaria, where she teaches urban design and planning and residential structures, and also the course on urban morphology. She has a Master of Science degree in architecture and a PhD in urban and spatial planning, with a thesis focused on the development of railway station areas in large Bulgarian cities. Her research interests are in the fields of contemporary urban transformation related to mobility landscapes, housing and public spaces, areas she has lectured and attended workshops, in which she has lectured and attended workshops in Bulgaria and internationally. She's also a member of two COAST program actions, European Middle Class Mass Housing and Urban Knowledge Arena. So I will share.
Hello, I'm Veneta Zlatinova, and this is From Complex to Complexity. Urban theorists and some urban morphologists consider the special form of the city a reflection of the society and its structure. On the other hand, some suggestions occur that the professional language of planners reflects the mainstream accomplishments and the leading technology of the historical period. The city was seen as a machine during the industrial age, as a space for transactions of capitals in the post-industrial period, and now it's considered a flow of information. The large-scale residential developments in Bulgaria that still shape the skylines of the large cities today are generally known as residential complexes, or simply complexes in everyday language. The wide use of the word for naming any type of residential development, regardless the scale and scope, might cause misunderstandings in both casual and professional conversations. The emergence and development of the meaning behind the term could reveal how the overall social, economic, political, cultural, and technological context could shape the meaning and use of terms and the connotations they bear. The literal meaning of complex in Bulgarian, according to the dictionary, is first a group of objects, actions, phenomena, or properties creating an entity, and second, a group of large, usually residential buildings neighborhood. Even the definition itself presents a discrepancy between the meanings of the term and the professional use of it. The two general changes of the social, economic, and political context that Bulgaria faced in the middle and towards the end of the 20th century caused significant changes in the development of all elements of life, governance, and spatial planning. The transitions in the context happened faster than changes in the spatial form of the cities, but their development during the period is an evidence of the context shaping the attitude to the urban space. Mass housing projects in Bulgaria emerged before the Second World War as housing provided for the workers in some large industrial developments. They were called villages or settlements, and though their scale was comparatively small to the later developed hierarchical typology of residential areas, they provided the architects in Bulgaria with the necessary experience for further developments. After the war, the context in Bulgaria radically changed. The new political paradigm denied the previous developments. In case of technical areas, even despite any recognized accomplishments. The new context was characterized by total control on the spatial planning, introduction of centralized planning, and nationalization of the property allowed for the implementation of large-scale urban developments and planning of ideas that could face the disapproval of comfort and confrontation of the citizens. After the death of Stalin, the general guidelines for establishing the socialist society were revised all over the socialist bloc. In terms of architecture and urban planning, this led to a major shift in style from neoclassicism dictated by Stalinist architecture to modernism. Discussions on the image of the cities and their reconstructions have been opened officially in Sofia in 1955, but the changes only followed decisions taken later in Moscow. The international style was embraced by the socialist ideology and promoted as the image of the bright future of living. Besides all other considerations, modernism was accepted because of its modularity and adaptability to industrialization. Thus, further, this allowed for faster and cost-effective construction of large number of housing that could solve the housing deficit in short terms. Uniformity of the buildings was predominant in the 1960s, along with the uniformity of master plans. These problems, which were among the major reasons for criticism by both professionals and inhabitants, were significantly improved during the following decades when new typologies and nomenclatures of buildings were developed and implemented, and more attention was paid to the open spaces, services, and landscapes in the design of master plans. The accomplishments could not overwhelm the flaws, and especially the failure of achieving the social goal to create local communities through the structure of the physical space. The negative attitude towards the complexes was most strongly expressed during the 1990s when the society rejected everything from the previous communist period. The complexes were associated with the communist past. The comprehensive planning was considered not compatible with the free market and private ownerships. The large-scale developments were not possible as there were no large investors and as the state left the housing sector. In the following decades of social and economic transition, development of real estate market and transformation of the planning system, the construction of housing stock repeated the cycle of its development from previous periods. It started with construction of separate residential buildings, then groups of buildings in available larger plots appeared, and finally the largest developments included complexes of hundreds of dwellings from various typologies, from house in a private courtyard to apartment in a block. At present, the national planning system does not face housing shortage at the general level. There are rather specific groups of people with no access to decent housing, while the real estate market is characterized by a significant excess of dwellings compared to the number of inhabitants. Centralized and comprehensive planning have been denied since the beginning of the 1990s, and so was the urban planning, which has managed to partially restore its role in the management of cities recently. Between 1944 and the middle of the 60s, the residential developments in Bulgaria had to solve the residential crisis caused by the war and by the rapidly increasing urban population in industrialized cities. The first appearance of the term complex in this period is related to the unification of the two central institutions responsible for architectural design and urban planning. It was done with the aim of establishing complex design ateliers. The complexity during this period was associated with the integration of professionals from different backgrounds in order to provide what we call now a holistic design through integration of planning and design that allows for achieving better, healthier, and efficient environment. During this period, the foundations of the later housing programs were laid. In the process of establishing the communist state and affirming its affiliation with the socialist bloc, the concept of micro-rayons or micro-districts and rayons or districts were adopted. It was embraced because the structure of the socialist city could satisfy the constantly growing material and cultural needs of the citizens, as it was said. It was developed theoretically through research of different typologies and their cost effectiveness. It was the restrictions of the available construction technologies and public finances that strongly impacted the image and style of realizations. No matter if it was the easier way to pronounce the word complex, or the fancier and sophisticated style it brought to the architectural speaking, or the fact that the complex had no exact relation to scale, the word entered the professional jargon from where it was transferred to everyday language. This was closely related to the most productive period for mass housing developments in Bulgaria between 1960s and 1990s. The large-scale residential developments in the outskirts of the industrial city significantly changed their structure, and the term was transferred to the names of administrative districts and replaced even neighborhood. Complexes were contemporary, provided with better infrastructure and facilities, newly built, and following the model of the socialist city. The name complex meant all of these facts, and it was opposed to the old neighborhood, which was considered a special concept from the past. In 1990s, the rejection of everything associated with the communist past was applied to the complexes, but the term had already been deeply rooted in the common language as a type of neighborhood and an administrative district, and was not replaced. In professional jargon, on the other hand, there were intentional efforts to replace it for various reasons. Besides the attempts to break the associations of planning with communist regime, planners were seeking for proper terms that would not cause misunderstandings and would not be confused with administrative units. Moreover, the complex was strongly associated with uniformity, while the society quickly turned to individualism in every form of expression. Housing typologies were addressed as residential forms. Microrayon was addressed as residential structure or structural unit, and the participation of the state and the local authorities was restricted to implementation of housing policies. The recent rehabilitation of planning and the raising awareness of the significance of public spaces returned the comprehensive approach in planning and architectural practice. So has the residential complex, although at smaller scales of residential group and with a different aesthetics. New residential complexes now again represent a better and contemporary lifestyle and oppose the mass housing complexes. They underline the qualities of the open spaces and the contemporary architecture. This has created the phenomenon of the complex in the complex, or the group of buildings in the residential unit. The case study I present is one of the most extreme examples of mass housing in Bulgaria. It's the complex Studentsky Grad, known as Students' Town. It was built at an extraordinary tight deadlines, according to the plans of architects Atanasova and Paeva and their team. It was officially opened in 1975 and was planned as a large campus of dormitories, university buildings, canteens, sport facilities, childcare, and educational buildings. Despite the compromised quality of buildings due to fast construction, which was pointed out by the professionals and public at the time, the master plan was appreciated for the carefully planned layout of the buildings with a view to the Vituša mountain, the landscaping that envisioned a settlement within a park, and the provision of most of the necessary public buildings and social services. After 1989, the landscaping of the complex was close to the image of a park with the trees having grown, but the changes in the layout of the complex started then and further developed exponentially. They began with filling the gap of services that existed in almost all residential complexes. The fact that the level of services in Bulgaria was considerably lower compared to other countries, especially developed Western European ones, was well known. First changes included introduction of small-scale shops and pavilions occupied by fast food kiosks, cafes, restaurants, all located strategically at the most visited places and busy walkways. Most of them were permanent, but gradually the number, the size, and the diversity of functions grew. These new additions to the entity of the complex were made one by one with no general guidelines, layout, or plan. They gradually occupied most of the areas envisioned for public spaces and services. Next wave of densification of buildings happened in the beginning of the 21st century and recently. They were related to the rising real estate demand for housing, and many free areas along the main streets were built up with large-scale residential buildings. Thus, from the initial idea of dormitories in a park, just a few islands were left and the connecting spaces were lost. The clear structure of pedestrian connections, the view to the mountain, the free access and open spaces disappeared. The integrity of the complex was broken and was replaced by the complexity of the current planning problems for providing quality of living, for balancing stakeholder interests, for preserving the campus-like character where it's possible, for repairing the structure of services and public spaces, and for maintaining the overloaded infrastructure. From one of the outstanding examples of complex planning, Students' Town was transformed in extreme example of the complexity of unsolved planning problems. The terms of habitation might reflect the general attitude of the society towards the housing policy, although their meaning varies in professional jargon and everyday life. The residential complex as a term reflects the extreme transformation of planning from total top-down approach and prioritizing commons to minimizing them. For less than a century, it has gone through a complete cycle, from the visionary approach and the propaganda image of the future of living, through the denied lifestyle of the socialist times, and now it's going through a revival as the fashionable high-class lifestyles of gated communities and residential developments. Thank you.
Thank you, Veneta. It's amazing how we share these terms within Eastern Europe, or urbanist terminology across Eastern Europe. In Romania too, we have exactly the same terms. Well, we call we called complex urbanistic unit, almost the same notion as you presented, and it was a notion that replaced microrayon too in the late 60s. And also what I found interesting is that you highlighted, and maybe this is an interesting issue to discuss, the transfer of the term complex from the technical professional environment to the everyday language, and how it changed its meaning. And it's actually usual that words that are technical, like the term complex, can work at these two different levels: the experts language, the theory speak of the discipline, and the everyday terms, lay people language. I don't have any question, frankly. I'm not able to put questions on realities that are so similar to what we have in Romania. So if there is a question if there is any question from the audience. Nobody has a question for Veneta? Well, maybe I have a question about the return of planning. You seemed to, one specificity of your paper was that you bring, more than the rest of the speaker, you bring the issue until what's happening today. And you seem to speak favorably about the return of the planning. Aren't there big problems with this real estate developments that you showed today? I mean, aren't there problems of the accessibility to these developments? I know that in Romania it happens too, and it's really a big problem that public housing has been sold, and these new developments actually cannot replace them because they're very, very expensive. You at some point say that they address any population, they address a large spectrum of population, but they don't address all the people. So what can you say about this? So the present day, a question about the present day.
Well, I think the most important reason for us to study the past is to understand the present and to have a look at the future. So studying the history of residential complexes could be helpful for us to make decisions on what to do in the future. Actually, what you are talking about is a major problem that we neglect actually, because the type of ownership in complexes is really complex matter too. Because everyone owner owns only his or her own flat, which is a box somewhere in the air, and the ownership of the lands is municipal or it is state owned. This is something like a problem that will arise sooner or later, I don't know. But there are some examples of this problem appearing around. For example, there is a building here in Sofia, one of the first complexes built in this industrialized construction typology, which had some defects in the construction, and it is no more possible to inhabit it, but it still stays with some major cracks in the walls and some walls that are not safe for passing by, for example, and it is not demolished, and it stays for a few years now. And I think the reason for it is this unsolved problem of ownership and of decisions after what we do after we do not use those buildings in the complexes anymore. This current programs funded by the state for rehabilitation of large buildings, aimed at improving the image of these types of buildings, and they go under the motto of energy efficiency, which means they have a better look after these programs. They are really improved, but the major problem that lays underneath is the ownership, and it is still unsolved. So when the life cycle of this building ends, which will happen inevitably someday, because buildings are not like pyramids, for example. They do not last for thousands of years. We should have a large problem, and we should have to decide, how do we provide homes for those people? How will the state or the municipality participate in this process? Will it be left for the inhabitants to deal by themselves, which will cause a great social problem, actually? And there are some research projects that tried to face this problem, but actually we do not have a solution until now. So I cannot answer this problem, and I cannot now say we should do that and it will be successful. Maybe it's about to try some different approaches, and in my personal opinion, this should not be left to the owners or to the citizens on their own, because they were involved in this problem through the participation of the state. So the state and the municipality should take their share in the solution of this problem.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So now we have seen all the presentations, and I invite you to have common discussions on the 4 terms. And please, I would like to invite the audience to address questions this time, in order to enliven the conversation more. I have prepared a few questions for you all, but I would like to have also from the audience some questions. So let me first make some comments and address a question for the beginning of these discussions. It's very interesting to have these 4 terms together and compare them, and they have a lot in common. All the 4 terms have specific meanings in their specific contexts, geographical, political, cultural, but at the same time, all 4 terms are words that can be found in other contexts too, are words that are perfectly translatable to other languages, almost as such. I mean, even between very unrelated languages, Russian, Italian, English, habitat is habitat, cooperative is cooperative, complex is complex, condominio is condominium. I mean, just pronounced a little differently, but it's actually the same words. So there is maybe a common language of housing architecture, of post-war housing architecture, even if we mean maybe slightly different things from one context to another. So my first question for you is about context. So I would like you to develop this issue of context. So while you researched your own term, did you look into other contexts than the Italian, French, Lithuanian, Bulgarian housing history? Does a term referring to modern housing need to clarify its meaning by comparison with similar terms elsewhere, or by putting it into larger context even? Or is it each local context self-sufficient for that? Is such a term entirely understandable through local histories? Is our language shared perfectly already? So this is my complicated questions for you, but essentially, please address this question of context for your term and how you worked with context in researching your term. I suggest we take the same order if you like. So start with Chiara if you want to begin.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
Okay. No, it was very interesting to look at the other countries, also to have an idea of to the international context. But yes, I think it would be very interesting to see at the condominium in other countries. The aim of my paper was to compare to the national context. Okay? So to the South Italy, to North Italy, and the medium large cities of Italy, because maybe this topic it is more studied in the city like Milan, more than Naples. I'm from Naples. I'm from the south of Italy. So the aim of my paper was to compare at the national phenomenon. But for sure, I think also if we look at the typology of Palazzina, Villa, for sure there are many connections. Also thinking about how this typology arrived in Italy, and I'm thinking particularly in Naples. So yes, it will be very nice. But I saw your papers was mostly focused on public or maybe more than private. So would you like maybe to answer to you about this topic, condominiums? How is the declination in your country? If you find some analogies in your countries about the private dwellings and private complex. So I ask you if you find some analogies in this sense.
Well, I already answered you in Romania. I'm starting, but then you'll have to answer her too. So in Romania, the public housing has been sold apartment by apartment. So we have now condominiums. Actually, the former grands ensembles in Romania are modular by module are functioning in associations, and the law of associations of owners, the law actually uses the word condominium. So each apartment is owned by a family, and they together form an association and share the ownership on the common parts. So we are, but actually this is what I like, that you talked about this transfer from private ownership to public housing of condominium by privatization. So I don't know how it is in, we should ask the other participants. Yeah, Zara, if you...
Sorry, taco mute, taco microphone.
Oh, you didn't hear what I say?
Yes. Yes,
Okay.
I heard.
Okay.
No, I was just commenting that in Portugal, it's exactly the same as you told. And we had not a communist regime, we had a kind of fascist regime till 74. And in fact, the public houses turn in private nowadays, and the organization is with the condominium. And the new public developments after the revolution, so after 74, were organized in condominiums. This is the Portuguese case, not the French one that we show.
Okay.
But I think, Zara, you are going to say something?
Yes, the way we approach the theme in terms of context, I think, well, we approached many years, so we couldn't go into detail, and we, of course, will envisage the theme as global phenomena. There were mainly public initiatives promoted by the state, and they were being developed in a very large way to look at the subjects. And I would say in a massive scale, looking at the country as the same cake. Of course, we can always see and find specific cases with differences and with more quality, and but in a way, it was a very massive way of looking to the phenomenon, and we can find very similar production in other countries, sharing during the Cold War, sharing even different ideologies and political ideologies and so on. I don't know if Professor Tostoes wants to add something.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
So, Marija.
Okay, so
So what about context? The Soviet context. I mean, you are closest from us, the Easterners.
yeah,
Closest
I
to
think
Russia.
the transformation was the same, because with this privatization of the formerly state apartments also provided that, especially in the large scale houses that were usually publicly owned, it produced sort of condominiums that and owners, renters became owners, and similarly they associated in the apartment owners associations, and it was of course a long transformation in acceptance that they do not own only the apartment, but they must also care somehow about the entire house. Or do they expect that the state still has to care about the house? So of course and it provided, of course, problems of renovation, because very many owners and the associations, they couldn't agree very, very easily. But yeah, this transformation happened similarly from public to private.
There is a question for you, Marija, but first we'll, in order to finish this this tour, let's hear what Veneta has to say about context.
In my paper, I was looking only at our context, although I knew there are quite a lot of similarities with Eastern European countries, for example, because everything that happened in Eastern Europe was ruled from the central power in Moscow. But something that is very interesting, and I think that is a little distinguishing our context, is that the ownership of flats in Bulgaria was private, even in Soviet times. So it was not exactly a condominium. It was not built, the housing stock was not built, not all of it was built as cooperative, although there were cooperatives too. But everyone owned, almost everyone owned his or her dwelling. So maybe this was quite a little difference. But all the other things, considering the maintenance of the entire building or the maintenance of the environment in the neighborhood, and all these issues, I think were the same.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Yoav Ben Naim. Hello, I have two questions to Professor Marija Dremaite. What is your personal standpoint approach to the subject of co-op housing? So your personal standpoint. And what is today the status of the co-op housing in Lithuania in terms of social use and physical condition?
Okay, so I will probably use this opportunity to also answer why cooperative, why I chose this typology. And in general, I researched mass housing and standardized panel housing for many years, let's say, and I started researching socialist housing in search of how individualized developments, non-standard developments, differently owned developments occurred. How could it occur in the socialist society when we, especially in the Soviet society, because usually the common understanding is that everything is state-owned, everything is gray, mass panel, mass housing. And therefore it is very closely connected with social stratification. Therefore, social status, income, education, and the desire to have a non-typical or non-standard living space is the driving force behind it. And therefore, I started researching cooperative housing, not only as a better off society, but also how this better financial status leads to a better architecture. Let's say, it's a hypothesis, but in many groups of society, it proves that these people were looking for different forms of non-standard housing, non-standard dwelling space. So that's my standpoint, and that's why I started researching this cooperative housing movement in mostly in late socialist period in 70s and 80s when it developed. Now, I also a little bit answered already to you, Dana, about in this question, what is the current status of these cooperative houses? They were very successfully privatized also, although they were on a very difficult to define what was their status, because they were paid off usually, but owners only owned the right to the apartment, but they do not own the land or the house. So they were also successfully privatized, and because they were of better condition already built when they were built, better materials, better planning, better maintenance, so of course they also stay today in a little bit slightly better condition, because they were first to go under renovation, they were insulated, they were probably somehow better kept. That's probably the answer.
Okay, thank you. Actually, I find it very interesting what you said, that the social typology, well, great approximation. We can say that your terms are social typologies, that they are related to quality in architecture, to architectural quality. And I think this is an issue, an interesting issue to see maybe more in detail how this leap is made from a social typology to an architectural typology. I already addressed this question to Chiara and you already answered, but maybe you could say something more concrete, formal, urban. So the terms themselves don't speak about architecture, but about this habitation processes. but they do actually lead somehow to concrete architectural types and concrete architectural expectations, let's say. So I had a questions, but formulated, but you already somehow answered. My questions was, how do you see the relationship between the kind of categories your each term describes, the so-called social typologies and architectural typologies? Are architectural types just derivatives or of larger social types, or are architectural typologies already connoted in social typologies? So if you can add something about this architectural side of your term that actually denote processes, not architectural forms. I mean, I'm bringing the discussions to architecture because one of the aims of our group was to show that or to find the terminology that underlines, highlights the importance of architecture and architectural terms. And your terms are not properly architectural. So if you can help me and develop this this idea of how we go from a social typology to an architectural typology, or vice versa. No, it's too vague a question. Well, actually, Chiara and Marija answered. Maybe Veneta, can you tell us something about the architectural side of the complex? Did the complex imply a certain typology?
Yes,
architectural typology, sorry.
yes, it did. The association with the complex, the major association that people here have with the word complex is the prefabricated panel buildings. So the complex is associated with the panelki actually. Although there are many different typologies actually, but the most widely spread was the type of panel construction. And say, you know, when something is more in quantity than it is associated with a type of word and type of residential unit, for example. But there are quite a lot of different architectural typology. Most of them were developed after the 70s. Someone previously said about liberalization in 70s and 80s. That was the period when architecture was taking the lead actually in forming the image of the new residential districts, and it was trying to fight the negative connotations of the context and of what was previously achieved and promoted as socialist city. So it was an attempt to improve the image of the socialist city through architectural forms. Maybe it was also due to influences that penetrated in Bulgaria from neighboring countries, for example, Serbia, former Yugoslavia, and Romania, but also Nordic influences could be traced here in residential complexes. In late 80s, the architectural typology was trying to improve not only the public spaces of the complexes, which was the first approach in late 60s and 70s, when there was a unification of building types, and the only opportunity for architects to improve the overall environment was to focus on the landscaping of the complexes. In late 70s and 80s, the attention was paid to the buildings, and this last example that was shown in my presentation for the historical development of complexes. The Zona B5, this peak of socialist construction actually was one of the examples when architecture was trying to improve the quality of living, to improve the plans of individual apartments, and also to provide a better image of these residential buildings. It is an interesting example also because this this area was designed as a place for artists, and here I make a connection with what Marija said previously. This was not exactly a cooperative housing, but this different type of housing was developed with the aim and so with the explanation that it provides particular and individualized habitation for people who with professions within arts, for example, artists and painters who needed ateliers and who needed additional rooms. So yes, there is a relation between the social structure and the social community and architecture. Yes, there was.
Okay, thank you very much. I don't have any questions, so if there is no question from the audience.
I can maybe, Dana. Sorry.
Yes, please, Gaia.
No, I didn't. In fact, I had some questions, but became more remarks because in part were already answered. But I found very interesting what you said about the different connotations that same term assume in a diverse context. I was thinking in a cooperative, and you already answered in part my doubt, Marija, because you say that you selected the non-standard form of ownership. And in Italy, the cooperative in the same period identify only a legal framework, so non-standard forms of interaction between public and private, but it's not cannot be identified by a typology or a specific model. So this is something that I found interesting, also because sometimes in this process of translation there are some misunderstanding. And also I was wondering if in these projects of regeneration of public housing that became a primate, the use of condominium is used in some way evoking the imageries of condominiums coming from other contexts, or which are the reasons of the use of the notion of condominium to identify this new mode of inhabiting. And then I had another comment related to the transfer of changing significance of certain notion like habitat. I found very interesting in the transfer from the disciplinary culture to the popular culture. So how habitat in the disciplinary debate that we know very well is used as a theoretical frame to deal with the post-colonial or decolonizing context, and became really a specialistic tool, in particular in the, I think, in the Francophone world. And I found interesting this idea to look and how the habitat is transferred in the everyday use. So in the cultural real estate market, in the popular culture, and it's something that also in this shift from technical to everyday emerged in Veneta paper. So this is another process of transfer, not linguistic, that I found very interesting. And then the last point is related to what Marija said, that I found very, very important, that our aim is not to define middle class, and I think it emerged also very well in the paper by Chiara. So the idea is not to define the stratification of middle class, but maybe to look how through house it can be really more homogeneous. Because if we look at the stratification of middle classes in all the contexts, it's really difficult to arrive to a definition. While reversing the perspective, maybe looking at the housing, we have a very homogeneous panorama, certain aspirations, certain ideas of modernity, certain typologies also that became representative of the social group. So I think that idea is really maybe to use housing as a lens to define, to investigate middle class could be interesting. So, we're on because you already answered.
Thank you, Gaia.
And Anna, I have a question.
Okay, please.
One more to Marija. Thank you for the answer for the other two. You said that the consumption of co-op housing shaped the middle class. So, in continuing to this, my question are how this class changed the political map in Lithuania or in the socialist countries, and how it affects us today, or it's demolished, the idea demolished when the Soviet bloc fall. That's it.
Okay, now we go into the political and social discourse of the Soviet or socialist society. Of course, it's not any more similar, and we must understand that somehow these better people of, I would use that term, which was already used in the Chiara's comment about this educated special group of people.
Professionismo colto.
Exactly, yeah, professionismo colto. So in a way, all these incomes were somehow shaped by informal ways, and we cannot say that people sometimes get those finances with which they could foster acquisition of apartment by very different ways. For example, it's easy to trace such communities in 65, for example, because of the housing cooperative called Science by the Lithuanian Academy of Sciences. Now, we know that it is usually professors who have higher incomes, and maybe it is somehow similar to professors somewhere in Poland or in Romania. But in late socialist period, in the 80s, there are more and more people who want to use their incomes to acquire the cooperative apartment. And these cooperatives start to be assembled not by the socially and professionally well-defined communities, but, for example, people who sells jeans on black market and gets more money, and some other people. So it's much more mixed, and then it is not very easy to define them as a professional or a social group. So I don't know if I'm correct. If it's the answer you want, is that the answer you want to hear. But I want just to stress that the wish to define the middle class in the socialist society is different because the social structure is different, and that it doesn't fit the Western modernity. And now in the contemporary Lithuania, it fits. And now we can much better trace the social stratification based on Western modernity.
Okay, thank you. If there is somebody else who wants to address a question, don't write it on chat, then you can just unmute the microphone and ask. If not, then I would like to thank all our presenter today, and to thank also the audience. And we invite you to to continue to attend our conference. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you for guiding this session, and it was so good to see you all again. Yeah, although virtually, but
continue with a chat, informal chat, because there are a few words that were the words of today. Informal declinations. Chiara, it was my favorite word.
Declinations.
Yeah.
Okay.
Usually the margins and deviations are more interesting than yes, the translations and the mistranslations are more interesting than the exact translations. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It was nice.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Gaia.
Bye.
Thank you, Dana. Thank you, Dana, for assisting technically.
If you want at 5:30, there are another parallel session, and also there's a different session at the same time if you want to see how they are now.
Okay.
Thank you, Dana.
Bye.
Bye.